Hey there, ZU podcast listeners. Just to let you know, the ZUcast is currently in stasis as we reorganize. We'll be taking a break from our regular full podcast format, but in the meantime, we'll still be posting some content to the feed, such as today's segment. That's it for now. We'll let you know when things change again, and on to the interview. Hello everybody, and welcome to the Zelda Universe podcast. My name's Cody, and I'm here with a special interview with two other podcasters. They're from the Sacred Realms podcast, the brothers Lyndon and Matt Willoughby. Hello.
Hey, Cody.
Hi, Cody.
So, who are you? What is it that you do?
I don't know, Matt. Who are we? What's our deal?
Man, that is
Not existentially.
I was about to say that's an existential, esoteric question. Well, we are just two brothers living in Texas.
And this is Matt speaking.
Yeah,
right now.
I'm Matt, by the way. I'm Matt. We are just two brothers living in Texas who like to talk about Zelda and who talk a lot anyway. So we decided we'd go ahead and make a podcast about it and let everybody hear our very opinionated thoughts, of which we have many.
We do. So basically, Matt and I, we are brothers. I am older by about 3 years. We have both been fans of Zelda for most of our lives. And there was a point in 2020, late 2020, which was, peak pandemic time, where we were bored, like many people around that time. And we were looking for something new to do to kind of take our minds off of things. And I, at the time, I'm one of those people who's always playing always playing a Zelda game. I replay all of them constantly, and I just kind of rotate through. And so we got the idea, oh, well, I've played all of these. Matthew really likes Zelda, hasn't played all of them. Let's start a podcast where we do a book club style analysis of the whole series, a game at a time, not necessarily in order. So that's how we became Zelda podcasters.
So, let's get into the real stuff now. You've made a list, a ranking list of the Zelda games as you go through your podcast, and you've determined that A Link to the Past is the worst Zelda game. Is that correct?
Of the ones we have played so far,
yeah, I was
of which
gonna
there
say,
are 5.
we may only be 5 games into this podcast, but you know what? Even with only those under our belts, sure, I think we can unilaterally say that A Link to the Past is the worst Zelda game ever made. No, that's not.
Yeah,
that's not how we
don't
feel.
take that one out of context.
Nope, that's not how we feel. Basically, where we're at is, we've played 5 games, and at the end of each season, we keep an ongoing ranking of the games that we've played. And I think kind of what we have figured out is that we sort of are front-loaded with some of the all-time great Zelda games. I mean, our first 5 games were Ocarina of Time, Link's Awakening, Skyward Sword, A Link to the Past, and Breath of the Wild. And I mean, that's 5 really good games right there. So, yeah, I mean, as unfortunate as it is, one of them had to get ranked at the bottom, but I think we both still very much enjoyed A Link to the Past. I've played it many times before. This was Matt's first time, and we were pretty much in agreement.
I will say that there has not been a single game that we've played that I didn't enjoy pretty much all the way through. I think that we've definitely hit 5 of the top 10, like in the first 5 games.
Yeah.
So it's I think we definitely front-loaded ourselves with a lot of real good Zelda.
The basic premise of our podcast has always been that we do not believe a bad mainline Zelda game exists. Like, we think the entire series is good in totality, and we think that it's exceptional in that way. And one of the reasons that we wanted to do this podcast was to kind of objectively reanalyze all of those titles and sit down and, with a critical eye, put that assumption to the test. And so far, 5 games in, we can say that presumption is holding true.
Yeah, I mean, objectivity going into it was a big thing for us because, we all have nostalgia for these games, right? Like, everybody has their first Zelda game, and everyone's going to think that their first Zelda game is the best Zelda game. And so what really we've tried to set out to do is, as much as possible, put that nostalgia aside and analyze the games for what they are and the games that they are and the impact they've had on the industry and, all of those types of things, right? And it's been hard in a lot of ways to put aside those feelings and look at the game for its own merits and then try to rank them. but at the same time, it's offered us kind of a new way to look at each one of these games that we've played. It's helped us to, see them for the excellence that they have, and also objectively look at it and say, hey, maybe this doesn't work quite as well as maybe the designers wanted it to, or this is kind of a dated thing that didn't age quite so well. I mean, things like that. And so being able to look at those pieces of these classic amazing games and put an objective lens on it has been a really interesting and fun thing for us to be doing.
And what is the current list, the ranking list right now?
So the ranking as it stands is number 5, A Link to the Past, number 4, Link's Awakening, and we played the Switch version of that, by the way. But I have played both. Actually, I played all 3 versions. Number 3, Skyward Sword. Number 2, Ocarina of Time. Number 1, Breath of the Wild.
I think this is actually quite an interesting list already, because in some ways it seems more like a Zoomer list than a millennial list, if you know what I mean. Like, a lot of people in our age demographic would tend to put something like Skyward Sword a lot lower and A Link to the Past a lot higher, for example.
Yeah.
I will say that this is one of the only areas where we have had some disagreement in our ranking, which we knew was going to happen. I mean, we actually have 3 voting members for each recap episode so that we can avoid deadlock, where Matt and I just, like, if we don't agree, then we're just kind of stuck. I personally rank Link's Awakening above Skyward Sword. I still enjoy Skyward Sword more than A Link to the Past, but Link's Awakening I do enjoy more than Skyward Sword. And I was outvoted on that one. But I think it's definitely true that all of us, Matt and I both, probably hold Skyward Sword in a higher esteem than a lot of people do.
Yeah.
And we knew that going into it. Like,
For sure.
Yeah. We knew going into this podcast that, like, that was one of the games that we both have a lot of fondness for. And I mean, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we went into that season, Skyward Sword, thinking that our ability to be objective about it was probably more important for that game than it had been for any of the other ones, because that's the one that I think we really needed to kind of put to the test.
Exactly. So, like, Skyward Sword going into this whole podcasting experience was my personal favorite Zelda game. And most of that comes from the fact that I really hold its storytelling in very high esteem. And also, I love dungeons. And Skyward Sword is basically just a dungeon after a dungeon after a dungeon.
With some of the best ones in the series.
Oh, absolutely. It has some of the strongest dungeons. So, like, the ability to be objective about what is good about Skyward Sword, but also what isn't good about Skyward Sword. And, like, there are definitely some flaws there, obviously. And I think we cover a lot of those pretty well. But I think it comes down to, I think a lot of people judge Skyward Sword too harshly based on the limitations that the Wii motion controls had and what they perceived as a non-successful gimmick. I think that most people, if they didn't like the motion control part of Skyward Sword, if they went back and played it on the Switch with the most recent port, they would have a very different idea of that game.
Yeah. But on the other end of things, we did find, so the other, I think, most common criticism of Skyward Sword is that the back half of the game is subject to a lot of unnecessary bloat, and
which we totally agreed with.
Yeah, and I mean, like, we definitely, that's one thing that is just inescapable about that game as you kind of go into it loses a lot of momentum going into its final act, and makes a lot of
poor decisions.
Yeah.
And it shoots itself in the foot in a very real way, going off of a run of extremely amazing dungeons and storytelling, and then just absolutely throws you into a loop of meaningless backtracking fetch quests that really kills the game in the last,
kills the momentum.
Kills the momentum. Yeah, it doesn't kill the game. No, it kills the momentum of what you've been doing.
Yeah.
In the last, quarter, right? Or not even quarter, eighth. In the last eighth of the game, you just get bogged down in a lot of really meaningless feeling things. But all of that to say that, like, we both went into this game and into this podcast knowing that we really do love Skyward Sword, and I've replayed Skyward Sword 3 times in my life, and that's probably as much as I've played any other Zelda game outside of Majora's Mask. We knew that it would be a little bit of a controversial opinion how we felt about Skyward Sword, and we're okay with that.
Yeah, it's interesting because Skyward Sword is one that I actually had For a couple of reasons, I sort of improved my ranking after playing the HD version. One of them is I think a lot of the motion control stuff worked a bit better.
Yeah.
And they just made some tweaks and that kind of thing. But also, at the time, I was sort of resentful of Nintendo's direction with the Zelda series. Twilight Princess came out in 2006, and this was the period of, Phantom Hourglass, Spirit Tracks, Skyward Sword. And in that sort of period, it was like, it felt like everything was becoming very narrative, very linear. Like, Spirit Tracks completely got rid of open world exploration and put you, literally on rails. And, it's my favorite Spirit Tracks joke. And Skyward Sword was very linear as well. It was sort of, I like to describe it as oops, old dungeons.
Yeah.
Because the overworld is a dungeon, and then the dungeon is a dungeon. And it's like, look, if you love dungeons, then Skyward Sword is just piling dungeons on you, and they're good dungeons. But for me, as someone who, the thing I like about video games and the Zelda series is often just wandering around aimlessly.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, well, I felt a bit constricted by it. But now that I've had Breath of the Wild and A Link Between Worlds, Nintendo has been in the direction of let's give people the opportunity to play some of that more open stuff again. Going back to Skyward Sword, it's sort of like I'm able to just focus on, well, what's it like as a game rather than what direction does this mean that the Zelda series is heading in?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because I did think that Skyward Sword is a good game, but it's sort of like there was a sort of stagnancy, I feel like, around that period of feeling like everything's just trying to be Ocarina of Time still, and it's been like 15 years.
One thing that we said in our most recent episode, which was our Breath of the Wild season recap episode, was that we felt like Skyward Sword represented the utter bitter end of the Ocarina of Time convention of creating Zelda games. And then Breath of the Wild was a point at which Nintendo had to evolve the franchise and create it into something new in order for it to move forward. And I think that you're absolutely right, Cody. Now that we have that, like now that we have Breath of the Wild and we have that new convention of 3D Zelda game moving forward, I think it's a lot easier to go back to Skyward Sword. And now that we know that that is not just the way that things are going to continue on forever, we know that we know that this formula has been shaken up and is now something different. I think it's easier to look more kindly on it with a lot of history having taken place since it was released.
The other part of the ranking that interests me is that Breath of the Wild is at number 1. I mean, that's not a particularly controversial opinion, but my impression from before you started your Breath of the Wild series was that Matt was one of those people who said, Breath of the Wild, it's a good video game, it's a good Assassin's Creed game, but it's not a Zelda game. Are you willing to defend yourself on this, Matt?
I'm gonna let Matt do that, but I do just want to say before he does that for the record, all 3 voting members of that recap episode voted Breath of the Wild into first place, including Matt.
Yep.
He was not a dissenting opinion.
Yep. So when I went into Breath of the Wild, I was kind of holding on to the Ocarina of Time, Skyward Sword era of Zelda was the era of Zelda that I grew up in. So it was the Zelda that I was expecting, right? And so I was holding on to everything that Skyward Sword represented, right? Which is that method of game design. And it was that linear, dungeon heavy style of game. And what I realized what I have been realizing through the objective lens of this podcast is that Zelda has evolved a lot over the course of its, 30 years of gaming. And that is always for the better, right? Like if Zelda had remained where it was from A Link to the Past and not evolved into Ocarina of Time, we wouldn't have Majora's Mask or Skyward Sword or Breath of the Wild. And trying to limit Zelda to The Legend of Zelda to a singular formula is only holding it back, right? And trying to sit there and say a good Zelda game has to follow XYZ formula, I think does The Legend of Zelda as a series a huge disservice. And I think that while Breath of the Wild has flaws, which we cover a lot of pretty significant flaws in our season, that, we kind of came together to say like, hey, Breath of the Wild is an amazing game, but these things don't work necessarily. Like specifically, lack of dungeons. Like there is not a single dungeon in that game other than unless you have the Champions Ballad DLC and the final like divine beast
final
thing.
trial.
The final trial is the only dungeon in that entire game. And like the shrines plus the divine beasts together don't make up for that. So like it's not to say that it's a perfect game, because it isn't. I don't think there's a single perfect Zelda game, but realizing what Breath of the Wild means, and it means that Zelda, The Legend of Zelda, is trying to reinvent itself and trying to find a new path forward that keeps it at the forefront of some of the most excellent video games in the world. I think it is very successful in doing that.
And that's going to be very relevant coming into your next season, which is Zelda 1 and 2,
Yep.
which I'm really looking forward to, because you are both not people who have, or you may have picked it up at one point, but neither of you have finished either of these games, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, Matthew hasn't played any of them, and I don't think that I've played more than an hour of Zelda 1, so.
Because this is the ultimate experimental stage of Zelda coming up, where everything was on the table. You sort of got a situation where Zelda 2's similarity to Zelda 1 in a lot of ways is very hard to track, aside from, Link's still in it. But like a lot of things were just being invented on the fly, like having a third piece of the Triforce or having a magic meter. All these things are sort of going to come into play in these early games, and I'll be really interested to see how you, as people who started with, was Ocarina of Time the first game for both of you?
Link's Awakening was my first game.
Ocarina of Time was mine.
Right, so you started with Zelda 4 and Zelda 5 and based your ideas of Zelda on that. And I think it was really interesting going in the A Link to the Past season. There was an episode that I think was a really good episode, if I say so myself, where I came on and we talked about A Link to the Past and sort of what's going on with things that you expect to be there but aren't there yet. Like you light all the torches in a room and nothing happens, and there's cracks in the wall, but they're not bombable, and there's dungeons, but they're only sort of dungeons, and you got wander around outside and do something else and come back in. That's the kind of thing that was there in the more experimental days. So I'm curious to see, especially playing Breath of the Wild just previously, how you're going to map the evolution, I guess, of the Zelda series.
I think, it's definitely going to be very interesting because the NES is a console from before either of our time. I was born into the SNES era, and Matt was born at around the time that the N64 was going to come out. So the NES was definitely before us. We don't have nostalgia for either of those two 8-bit games, and I think we're very excited to, again, like we said earlier, apply a critical and objective eye to the gameplay and to kind of analyze it in that way. I think the big struggle for us is just going to be getting around some of the obvious, not limitations, but conventions of games of that era, right? Like, I don't think that we're going to, for instance, be sitting around saying that the sprite work is as beautiful as it was in like A Link to the Past or anything, like stuff like that. It is a game of a certain time. Like we'll always have to balance that fact against the way that our interests and our likes and dislikes about this series have evolved based on our experiences with more recent games than these. So it's going to be a tricky thing to balance.
Yeah, how do you, for instance, judge visually or mechanics wise an NES game against Breath of the Wild when we're coming off of the most visually up to date, the most mechanics up to date, the most physics engine, like all of these things? It's the most currently modern Zelda game, and we're going all the way back to the beginning, back to back. And so that's going to be kind of an interesting culture shock in some ways, and trying to judge the game for what it was at its time is going to be important for us, right? Is going to be not necessarily looking at, compared to Breath of the Wild, what is this like? But for the era in which it was made, for its impact on the series, for its impact on gaming as a whole, all of those things are more important than are the graphics compared to Breath of the Wild.
Yeah, but at the same
Like,
time, it is tough because one question that we do have to answer is, did we like it? Like, did we personally have fun playing it? And
yeah, no, that will be a very personal preference question.
Yeah, and I think it will be interesting in terms of, because you might, have to change some things up about the format, in the sense that, like, previously you've largely been saying, well, let's not rely on guides or, use save states or any of this kind of thing. But when it comes to the earlier Zelda games, if you're not looking at the instruction manual with the map, with icons listed on the map and that kind of thing, you're not actually having the same experience as the kid who played it back then, who did have the strategy guide and did have the instruction booklet, which had useful information in it and all of that kind of thing. And it will be interesting to see, I guess, how that will change things.
yeah, and I think we were actually talking about this earlier today because who was it? I think it was Max. We were talking to Max Nichols, who is a frequent.
Oh yes, we can't have an episode without you shouting out Max Nichols.
Yeah, I know.
It's
right?
basically impossible.
That would be my colleague, Max Nichols.
You always have to throw that in there,
yeah,
too.
I do. No, so Max is a frequent guest on our show, in addition to yourself and several other people. And Max was telling us something last week about the importance of guides to a lot of these games. And I think that one thing that we're going to do is we are going to read the instruction manuals before we start playing, and we will keep them for reference while we're playing. And we'll discuss, I think, we'll discuss that, especially in like the first episodes of each game, episode 1 of Legend of Zelda, episode 1 of Adventure of Link, because it's really interesting, right? Like, the instruction manual as a helpful part of the experience is something that, for the most part, really went away. I would say maybe even around, like, maybe between Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. I would say even by the time you get to Ocarina of Time, most everything that you could find in the instruction manual was being communicated to you in gameplay anyway. So it's really something that has not been a part of these games for a very long time. But I'm fascinated by instruction manuals and by the craft of them. They're a very quirky and interesting part of an older era of game design. And so, to your point, Cody, we will definitely be making that a part of our playthrough experience, because I do think it is, in many ways, I think the way that these games were meant to be played when they were released.
Yeah, it will be interesting because a lot of old people, talking about Max, talking about Melora, shout outs to all the old people. A lot of them have experiences that I never considered because I grew up in the GameFAQs era. Like, a lot of people, if you ask them, they'll be able to dig up, this is my map of the original Legend of Zelda that I drew. I created a grid. When there was an interesting thing on there, like a shop, I put that icon in myself. And you'll find a lot of resources like that for some of the older Zelda games. And I just think that's a really fascinating piece of video game history that is lost to us young people who grew up in the post-NES era.
So it's actually really funny. Several months before we even started the podcast, I had purchased a copy of, man, who's the artist who does this? It's Phil Summers. Phil Summers has a series of hand-drawn game guides that they have created and put up for sale. handdrawngameguides.com, I think is what it is. Anyway, if you Google hand-drawn game guides, then it's in there. But he did one for Zelda 1, and I've got a copy of that as well as a PDF downloaded to my machine. And I'm definitely going to be referencing that as well. But it's just a really well done little guide. The artistry is cool. It has like a very drawn in math class sort of look to it. But I think it seems like it really has a fun collection of information about that game. So yeah, I don't think either of us are going to be too snooty about not using guides or anything for Zelda 1. I think kind of my opinion on this is that anything we can really do to remove some frustrations and give the game itself room to be enjoyed is going to be a net positive.
All right, so we'll wrap up the interview for now, and I'll give you the opportunity to promote all of your stuff. So how do people get involved with the Sacred Realm? How do they give you money? What do they get from giving you money, etc.?
So we have a Patreon, and that is patreon.com/sacredrealmspod. And we have several different tiers that are on there. At the top 2 tiers, you kind of get involvement with let's see, I mean, listener mail, the Discord server that we have set up, which is currently for patrons only, but we may change that in the future. They get their names read on the show every week. And then at the very highest level, we actually have trading cards that I make every month. And I'm actually a little bit behind right now, but anybody who is pledged to that top tier for an entire year will receive 12 trading cards, and they are designed around the games that we're playing at the moment. So yeah, that's kind of the big extra thing that we try to funnel people towards, aside from just listening to the show, which is available on all the major podcast carriers. But we also have got social accounts set up. We're on Instagram and Twitter at Sacred Realms Pod. I think Twitter's probably the more active of those two things. We have a decent amount of engagement there. But what do you think, Matt? Do we have anything? Was I forgetting anything there?
No, I think that covers it. Our Patreon supporters, starting at $1 a month for our Kokiri Sword patrons, you get access to our Discord channel. So right now we're just keeping that to our patrons only. It's new. Like, I think we've had it for over
2 weeks.
About 2 weeks now.
Yeah.
And it's already just really, really awesome to see our community starting to engage with each other in a really cool way.
Yeah.
So if you want to get on a Discord server and talk with some really cool people about Zelda and share experiences and stories and tips and tricks and talk to Lyndon and I in a more personal way, head on over and we'll pop you in the Discord channel.
Worth mentioning too that all patrons and anybody who's subbed to any level of our Patreon is able to vote on which game we play next after we've finished the one that we're currently on. And we made an exception to that rule when we were going to do Breath of the Wild, because that game was so long that and with the sequel coming out next year, probably we knew it was time to get it out of the way now, and so we kind of overrode the voting process and just said we're playing Breath of the Wild at this time. But for the most part, we alternate back and forth between the top down and the 3D Zelda games, and every time it's time to pick a new one, we let our patrons vote on which one that's going to be next. So that's how we ended up with Zelda 1 and Zelda 2 for this next season. It was up against the Oracle games and A Link Between Worlds.
Yep, and here we are.
I look forward to your show. Are you taking a break at all for this next season, or are you just jumping straight back in?
We're probably going to jump straight back in. We're kicking around whether or not we're going to do a singular off-topic episode in the intro, but I think it's looking like we might just jump right in. So semi-undecided, but if we do take a break, it'll be just a one episode off-topic.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you around.
Awesome. Thanks, Cody.
Appreciate it.